Hey guys, so if you're watching this video, your Breville Smart Grinder Pro or your Barista Series coffee maker grinder has probably bit the dust. So I was grinding some coffee the other day, and I don't know if a rock or something got into the burr, but the motor all of a sudden loaded up and then suddenly just started to free spin, and I heard this gnarly, gear grinding, skipping sound coming from the inside of the grinder, and I sort of figured that one of these teeth bit the dust. And so I took it apart, and lo and behold, the main drive gear here was shredded. You can see the teeth on the top of this were just kind of flattened out and ripped off. And so Breville does not sell a replacement gear for this very expensive coffee grinder. And so your $200 plus coffee grinder is now just a useless brick. And so I decided to design a replacement gear that's 3D printed. So I reverse engineered the standard gear. You can find this gear for sale on my Etsy shop. That'll be linked in the description below. But basically it's an identical drop-in replacement to the standard gear with a couple modifications. So one, the spacer is printed separately just to make it easier to print, and so that's that little black ring there. I've also widened the contact patch on the part of the gear that got shredded on my original gear. So now there's more contact area to hopefully help reduce the chance of this happening in the future. You can see here that gear tooth is just a little wider. So the following is a how-to video on how to replace this gear on the Smart Grinder Pro. I'm sure it's sort of similar in the Barista Series coffee maker. I hope this helps, and enjoy the video. Thanks. All right, so here's my Smart Grinder Pro by Breville. And like I said, I stripped the main drive gear. I don't know if a rock or something got in there, but you can see here, this is the main drive gear, and there's just a few teeth on the side that are just kind of stripped off. It's pretty subtle, but you can see right there at the top, those teeth are flattened, and it kind of makes this thing totally useless. So $200 grinder just down the drain. Here's a list of tools you need. I like to use these little ramekin cups to keep screws and stuff organized. Here's a super long Phillips head screwdriver. This is super important because there's some really long or hard to reach screws that you'll need. And then I also have these little magnets, and these are really useful because you can kind of rub them along the tool you're using to magnetize it. They'll kind of hold on to screws, and you can also use it to reach in and get stuff. Get a brush to clean out the coffee grinds. Here's a pair of channel lock pliers. Comes in handy, but anything similar will work. And I've just got a bunch of random screwdrivers. Really, you don't need those, but they're kind of handy if you don't like power tools like me. So I like to use this drill. It just makes things faster to disassemble. So a drill with a drill extension and that long screwdriver for disassembly makes this go pretty quick. So I'm going to start by flipping the machine over and uncoiling the power cord. And then in the corner of the machine, there are 4 small Phillips head screws. So I'm going to put a Phillips head driver into my drill, and I'm going to go ahead and remove the 4 screws on each corner of this machine. And again, it's handy to have these little ramekins. You'll see me use them throughout the video to store these, so I like to break it up by step. So this is step 1, and I've even taken a Sharpie and I've labeled these ramekins, and I use these for tons of different projects, so I keep these handy on my workbench. So I drop in kind of the step number 1 screws into the ramekin, and just to remind myself what screws go where, I'm going to throw that rubber pad in there just to kind of as a placeholder, so I know that when I see that ramekin with the rubber foot, those screws hold the feet on. So now this wire passes through the base plate. You're going to kind of have to shimmy that wire through the base plate. And you want to push almost all of the slack through just to help, give you enough room to work. So the more of that power cord you can push through, the better. Also mention, always have this unplugged when you begin working on it. Never work on this when it's plugged in. So the next step is we're going to put a long driver extension onto our drill, and then we're going to break out that really long Phillips head extension bit. Again, this is a critical tool. You have to have a super long Phillips bit to get this done. And if you don't have one, there's a pretty narrow slot to get to these 4 screws, so go out and buy one of these. You need it. I just pointed out the location of those 4 screws, but if you look down through the chassis of this thing, you'll see them reach way down in there and back these screws out. And these 4 screws are what hold the top onto the upper portion of the coffee grinder. So that's the plate that your coffee bean hopper bolts into. And you can see this is just a headache to get these screws out. It sucks. If I could have a longer drill extension, that would make things easier, but you can see it just fell out of my drill driver fell out of my extension here, and I have to go fish it out with a pair of pliers. Kind of a pain. And just wait till we put these screws back in. That's probably the best part of this whole process. So I'm backing out these 4 screws, and then once we have that done, we'll be able to remove the upper plate. Okay, so I've got all 4 screws out. Now we can carefully rotate the grinder over and gently remove this upper plate piece. There's a wire in the back of it, so that's why I say gently. Be careful, because you don't want to, rip the wire out of the little switch that it attaches to. And that's kind of a common theme when you're disassembling this thing. It's a pretty sturdy machine, but like there's a ton of wires moving through this thing. It's like a freaking spaceship in there. So just be careful not to like tug on any of those wires if you can help it. So the next step is we've got to make a little more slack. Oh, I think I missed one of the screws here is what it was. Yeah, so I had to back out one of those 4 long screws. I didn't quite loosen all the way. And of course, I lost my driver in there again. So I gotta go retrieve my driver extension thing. Okay, so 4 screws are out. The lid of this thing is off. You can see the wire. There's a little micro switch on the back that is basically it's the grinder node that the hopper is attached. So the next thing we're going to do is remove the burr. So I've already kind of twist locked, removed the burr thing. You've probably done that before to clean the grinder. I'm going to remove the nut on the top of this burr. Notice it's a right-hand thread, so it's backwards. So rotate it clockwise to loosen, and then you can pull the burr off, and there's 2 washers. There's a flat washer, and there's a lock washer. We're going to take those, and we're going to break out a new ramekin, and we're going to put all of the parts and pieces from this upper burr assembly into the ramekin, again, just to keep things organized. If you make it through this repair without any spare screws left over, then pat yourself on the back because you did better than me. But it's really crucial to keep this thing organized as you're going through it. So I've grabbed a pair of needle nose pliers. I forgot to mention that in the tool list, but that's helpful to remove this, I forget what this thing is called, but it slings the coffee grinds out of the way. Remove that and then reach in again, and there's this little felt seal washer thing. We're gonna grab that, and then there's 2 small flat washers that sit under the rotating burr. We're gonna grab those off and drop those into the ramekin. So here's a trick. Sometimes those things are hard to grab, so this is the magnet trick I was talking about. If you grab those magnets, stick them on the end of a screwdriver, it'll help you fish out the little parts and pieces that are in this thing. Notice there's a ton of coffee grounds in there, so I'm going to take this off camera and I'm going to brush this out and clean it. Alright, so I'm back. I took this over to the trash can with that brush and just brushed out the coffee grounds out of the kind of the area underneath the burr, just to minimize the mess, because there's coffee grinds get everywhere. You'll see this bench just get filthy as the repair goes on. Alright, so the next step is you kind of gently, if you can pull some slack through on that wire in the top, that's helpful, just so that the upper plate can have a little more room to move. I've also, this is not the first time I've been into this grinder in this video, so there's a couple places that have some zip ties that I've removed that kind of capture some of the wiring, so feel free to snip some of those if you need some more slack. I've removed these 2 screws that sit over the display. You can see there's 2 Phillips head screws that hold the LCD display onto the grinder. Again, I'm going to break out a new ramekin and store those 2 screws in that ramekin. And I'm also kind of organizing the ramekins along the back wall there, like in order of step. Again, just so like when I reverse this process, I can keep track of what goes where. All right, now we're getting into the guts of this thing. Tons of wires. This is the grind coarseness adjustment screw. This isn't necessary for the repair we're doing, but if you ever disassemble the kind of the gear mechanism here, it's useful to rotate your grind to full, I guess it doesn't matter, it could be full fine or full coarse until it hits the little stop screws. And then I use a Sharpie to mark the 2 gears, and I also mark the position of the white gear relative to the little encoder thing that's right there. So this gear system basically just tells the grinder like what coarseness position that it's in, and so if those 2 gears were separated, you can get out of whack and like your grind adjustment will no longer correspond to the setting on the screen. But for this step, like I said, you don't really need to do that, or for this repair. But just to, I don't know, be extra cautious, I went ahead and did it. So I'm going to break out the extra long Phillips head extension again, and there are 4 screws that hold the kind of the gearbox grinder assembly in place. And so I'm going to go ahead and back those out. So there's screw number 1. There's also a flat washer that you can see right there that sits underneath of that screw. And that's true for the remaining 3 screws on this assembly. I'll also note that, so the washers that sit under the screw have a smaller hole inside, like a smaller ID. Here I'm going to put a magnet on the end of my bit just to fish out the screw. But with regards to those washers I was talking about, the washers that go directly under the screw have a smaller kind of inside diameter. When we pull this assembly out of the kind of the chassis of the grinder, here you'll see I'm rubbing the magnet onto the Phillips head extension to magnetize it so that it'll pull the screw out with it when I back it up. Alright, so like I was saying, third time's a charm. The washers underneath of this gearbox assembly have a larger inside diameter than the washers we're removing in this step, so just kind of keep note of that. The 4 pads that hold this gearbox assembly into the grinder chassis are held by 4 screws. Immediately under the screws are the washers with a small ID, and then when you remove the gearbox assembly, there will be washers with a larger ID. So there's a total of 8 washers kind of in this step.
Uh-oh.
Here I'm going to try to fish out the screw with some needle nose pliers. This is really the hardest part about this whole repair, is just it's so tight in there, and it's pretty difficult to, you know, get all the parts and pieces out of this thing. And unfortunately, the disassembly is the easy part. Reassembling is going to be really tricky. It's kind of an extra pain. So I've removed, I think, all 4 screws. Stash that ramekin in the back, and now the gearbox is free. And so this is the guts of the thing. Now you'll notice you can pull this gearbox up a little bit, but pretty soon the wires beneath it are going to keep you from being able to remove it anymore. And so we've got to flip this thing over, and there's a little control box in the bottom of this thing. It's this white box with the wires on the left. There's a circuit board in it. We're going to have to remove that and kind of flip it around to give us more slack so that we can get this thing out. So there's a screw there I just tried to point to. We'll go ahead and back that out. Again, everything here is Phillips head screws, but the screws are different sizes, so you got to keep track of what goes where, hence the ramekin thing. There, I fished that screw out. I'm going to drop it into a brand new ramekin. Okay, and now we're going to remove the second screw that holds this white kind of control board box thing in place. So it's on the right side there. Back that out. Sorry, it's kind of hard to see, the drill blocks the view. Grab my magnets on the end of the screwdriver, fish that second screw out, and then drop it into that same ramekin and kind of add it to the stash. Again, trying to keep things organized by process step here. So this gets a little funky, a little tricky. Just again, be careful to not tug on any wires too much, but we're going to back this white control box out and just carefully, you know, work your way through until, you know, and pay attention to how much slack is in the wires and stuff so you can loosen this thing up. Again, there were some zip ties and stuff I had to remove to make this happen. So it looks like I'm feeding some slack in from where the gearbox was. And the idea is we just need to back this white box out just enough to where we can flip it around, and then we'll be able to pay out a lot more of the wires that are holding the gearbox in. Ultimately, the goal is we need to, you know, obviously we need to get into this gearbox, and there we go. So I'm flipping that thing over, and now there's way more wire slack that we can pay out through the top of this machine now. Flip it over and stuff that box back in. And again, just be really careful, kind of mind the wire tension when you're backing this out. The ultimate objective is we need to get to the underside of this gearbox, and there's 4 or 5 screws that hold that gearbox together, and that kind of is the last step to accessing the stripped gear that we need to get to. So you can see I'm kind of trying to push that up from the bottom, just to give us more slack. And I think here's where I discover that the power cord is the holdup. And so we're going to have to remove the little clamp on the power cord to give us more slack. So right here there's a little strap. Again, 2 more Phillips head screws. We're going to back those out, and that'll let us push this power cord through to give us more slack. Again, I'm going to put this in its own little dedicated ramekin. And I'm going to keep that little plastic strap with those screws too, just again to like kind of avoid any potential for confusion and mix matching the screws. There, now I'm stuffing the power cord down through, and now we should have lots of slack in these wires to pull this gearbox out of the bottom. The gearbox is kind of heavy with the motor and everything, so just, you know, try not to hang it from any wires and stuff, because again, you don't want to break any of these connections. This thing is wired up like a spaceship. All the sensors and switches. So here I'm pointing out the screws that hold the gearbox backplate on. Again, just Phillips head stuff. So there's one, I think there's 2, 3, 4 of those screws, so fresh ramekin. I'm putting the magnet on my drill bit so that the screws will stick to the drill bit nicely. Too nicely, it looks like. There's screw number 3. Screw number 4. And is that all of them, or is there one more? Maybe one more screw hiding back behind the motor there. Let's see. Nope, that's it. So there's, I guess, 4 screws. So there's your motor shaft, and now we're into the gearbox. You'll notice in this video, though, I've already replaced this gear once with one of the prototypes I made. So the gear that we're changing is actually black in this video. Yours will be white, like the one I showed at the initial video, or the beginning of the video. So this is the gear in question. This is the one we're after. And so I've slid out the main, or like the main drive shaft with the slipper clutch gear. There goes our black replacement gear, and then there's a little shaft that pulls out of this thing, like a jack shaft, and there's a spacer on this one. Again, that's just how, if you buy my gear off of Etsy, to make it easier to 3D print, I've split the replacement gear into gear and then a spacer, whereas the factory Breville gear has the spacer kind of molded in, but same thing, just 2 pieces. And so we're in. Okay, so here's like in a little aside, I guess. Here's the gear shaft, I don't know what you want to call this thing, but there's a slipper clutch built into it. And this is what's supposed to protect the gearbox in the event of, say, a rock gets into your grinder. This thing is designed to skip, essentially, and slip and not trash your gear teeth. Mine, obviously, and probably yours if you're watching this video, didn't do a good job of protecting those teeth. And so I would recommend disassembling this and just kind of inspecting it, and if you want, slather some grease on this thing. So when you pull this part apart, you got to be careful not to lose anything, but there's 6 little ball bearings, and then there's little springs. If I could show you under the camera, there's little springs that sit in little pockets inside of this gear. So I take the magnet and I pull those springs out. You don't have to totally disassemble this thing, but I would just, you know, take that front plate off, smear some grease in there, you know, with the hope of, if you ever lock your grinder up in the future, this thing will be able to slip this time and not trash your gearbox. I've experimented with removing a couple of these little balls, like in this video. So I've actually removed one of the little detents in an effort to try to make this thing slip more easily. I wouldn't recommend doing this, I don't think, because when I tried this, I put the whole thing back together, and the first time I tried to grind coffee, it just sat there and spun, and it just clicked, and it didn't actually grind anything. So yeah, I think it's important that you have all 6 detents in there, just to make sure that you can transmit enough torque through this thing to actually, you know, grind coffee. But I also think it's important to make sure this thing is in proper working order and well greased, so that if, you know, something does jam up, your gearbox doesn't explode again. Okay, so when it's time to kind of reassemble the gear train, first thing I just want to point out this little shaft. If this comes out, notice it's got a short end and a long end on this shaft. The short end goes down into the black base plate of the gear. The long end will point upwards. When you buy my gear off of Etsy, you would want to drop that little spacer onto the shaft next, and then the gear goes right on top of the spacer. Just like so. Give it a little test spin. Good to go. Then you're gonna drop the kind of the slipper clutch gear in place. You know, you got to twist it a little bit just to make sure it meshes with the other gear. There we go, and the whole assembly is keyed in together now, and it's looking good. So I would recommend greasing this. I used just general purpose lithium grease, and I was pretty liberal with it, so put a big scoop of grease in there and make sure it gets on both gear faces. So that's the part of the gear that meshes with the motor, and then the part of the gear that meshes with the other gear. I would load that up with grease. I don't know, in my mind, you can't have too much. All right, so here I'm taking a generous scoop of grease, and I'm just kind of slathering it on those faces we talked about. I think I'm gonna go in for a second scoop. Like I said, load it up. I'm gonna give it a little spin just to kind of spread the grease around a little bit, but it'll obviously do this on its own as the grinder's running. So it's looking good. So now we're ready to put the top back on this thing and start running all this back in reverse order. So I didn't kind of film the whole reassembly, but if you did a good job of keeping the screws organized and stuff, you can actually follow this video step by step in reverse, and everything goes back together just the same as it came apart. Same order of operations is the key thing. Snug up all the screws, but remember these are self-tapping screws in plastic in most cases, so don't over tighten them because you run the risk of stripping the threads. And then give this thing a test run. I would start on a really coarse grind and give it a couple rounds of grinding just to let the gear teeth kind of set and break in, let the grease smear around, and then your $200 Breville coffee grinder that you couldn't get a replacement gear for is now back in action. So I hope this helps you. I know I was really bummed whenever my grinder bit the dust. It always sucks to think of such a nice piece of equipment with so much life still in it is completely obsoleted by just a cheap little plastic gear. And so yeah, I hope this helps you out, and happy grinding. Okay, one more little side note for reassembly that may make your life easier. These washers I talked about that go under the gearbox, notice how that's like a larger ID flat washer, and there's 4 of them that sit on the little feet under the gearbox. All right, pro tip that I would do if I were to do this again is I would put a little drop of super glue on all 4 of those washers just to make sure that they don't pop back in place, because the motor itself is magnetic. It's got magnets in there, and it wants to suck those little washers off of their pads, which makes it really frustrating to assemble this part. And so once you manage to jimmy this thing back in place, being careful not to pinch off any of the wires and stuff, if you make it all the way through and all 4 of those washers are still in place, some kind of miracle just happened. So, all right, then once you have the gearbox kind of on its pads and you go to put the screws in on the top of the gearbox to kind of hold it in, those 4 screws, there's a Phillips head screw there, and you see that little flat washer. That's the one with the smaller ID that goes on the top. Again, I think another pro tip is I would probably put those washers onto the gearbox first, and then put a little dab of super glue or something just to hold them in place. So this first screw, that one you've got pretty easy access to, but there's 2 in particular on the right side of this machine as we're looking at it that just really are a pain to get to. So I would recommend, before putting the gearbox back in, put those washers on top of the gearbox on there and put a little dab of super glue on there just to keep them from flying around on you when you try to assemble this thing, because it can be tricky.